Welcome to Unpacking Ideas, and thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be unpacking Pragmatism by William James. Helping me unpack this book today was Brent Mondoskin. Brent is a fellow facilitator at the New York City Philosophy Readers Community, and he's also a longtime student of William James and Pragmatism. In our conversation today, we talked about the historical context of pragmatism, the present dilemma in philosophy, James's concept of tough and tender-mindedness. We got into the pragmatic method, belief change, the web of beliefs. And then towards the end of our conversation, we talked about pragmatic truth, meliorism, the distinction between pragmatism and relativism, metaphorical truth, and pragmatism's place in the world today. I'm super grateful for having this conversation with Brent. He really added a lot of important nuance to my understanding of pragmatism and even kind of cleared up a few misconceptions I had coming in. So I hope there's lots that you guys are able to take away from it as well. And now here it is, my conversation with Brent on pragmatism. All right. Awesome. Welcome to the podcast, Brent.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have the privilege of seeing you pretty much every week to discuss ideas at the, I don't even know what it's called now, the New York Reading Philosophy Community, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, but it's a growing community, and it's like almost 6,000 members now. So.
Yeah, it's crazy. A lot of different stuff going on.
Yeah. We actually had our first conference for it this year, and you presented on pragmatism. And I remember you saying it was one of the philosophies that you continued to return to. Why do you think that is? Why do you think you've gravitated towards pragmatism?
Yeah, I think I found that some of the other philosophies I was dealing with kind of lost sight of the humanism that I like about pragmatism, as well as some of the other philosophies, and we can talk more about this later, kind of, are what I would say a little bit more life negating, or a little bit more looking for something else besides what we currently have, Right. And I think there's definitely, positive aspects to that, but there's also, for me, I think it was a little bit, I like the strongly grounded in this world humanism of pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
And it's hopeful, but also, and it's realistic, but helps you make actual life decisions, right? Kind of in a way, without being trite or simplistic, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, if I remember correctly, James takes a few shots at Buddhism in here as well, kind of calling it life negating. And this was actually my first kind of foray into reading James. He's been on my list for a long time, but yeah, very interesting kind of cross between early psychology and philosophy. He was kind of rubbing elbows with Charles Peirce in the 1870s. They had what's called the Metaphysical Club, where they were kind of discussing some of these ideas. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the time in which James was writing, some of the things that were happening.
Yeah, for sure. I think his relationship with Charles Peirce, C.S. Peirce, is really instrumental to his beliefs in pragmatism and kind of how he worked through that. Peirce has a couple of great articles where he introduced the word pragmatism. A couple, 2 decades before this lecture, whatever that is, a couple decades before. But yeah, they were part of that Metaphysical Club. There's a great book also called Metaphysical Club, worth reading, traces the history of it. Also in that club was Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice. So definitely an eclectic mix of very smart, socialites in Boston at the time. So that is really, really interesting place to be, I think.
Yeah, to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I also kind of just put together some, different dates of things that were kind of happening around this time. So this piece is, actually a series of lectures that was then turned into a book. So the lectures occurred in 1906 at Harvard University, and then became this book that was published in 1907. But, some things leading up to that, Darwin's theory of natural selection is fresh in a lot of people's minds. He published his Origins of Species in 1859. The end of the American Civil War, 1865. Like we mentioned, the Metaphysical Club is happening around 1872. And then also, just psychology very much in its infancy. Just to give some perspective, Freud's interpretations of dreams comes out in 1900. So I think this kind of sets a little bit of the stage of where James is writing from, and we'll talk about like what he sees as kind of like the present dilemma in philosophy, and I think a lot of that is related to these things that are happening very much of his time.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's your mention of Darwin and statistics and kind of the Civil War, I think, are some really key drivers. Obviously, the Civil War affected everybody at the time, including James and his family. But as Darwin's thoughts kind of became more pervasive throughout all of the thinking at the time, that really, without Darwin, there couldn't have been this pragmatism, and there couldn't have been this movement, right? So I think that scientific-minded aspect of the thought was really instrumental for this pragmatism.
James kind of talks about his age being the age of science. Maybe I'll read a quote or two on this to kind of set us up. He says, "Never were as many men of a decidedly empiricist proclivity in existence as there are at the present day. Our children, one may say, are almost born scientific, but our esteem for facts has not neutralized in all us religiousness. It is itself almost religious. Our scientific temper is devout." So, very much talking about this kind of culture of scientism. But he is also quick to say we also have this kind of competing need for religion. And I think he sees this as kind of like a, psychological dilemma within all of us. We want the facts, but we also want some kind of God or religion. And, to foreshadow a little bit, I think he's going to sell pragmatism as the solution to that dilemma. But do you want to say any more about that?
I mean, absolutely. I think that I love that aspect in that quote he said. I think certainly parallels to today. We think of our children as almost being born with an iPhone in their hand or whatever, right? So every age has their thing. I think in this case, the scientific mind is definitely come really much in ascendance here. But his point is there's a religious tendency that we have from a psychological standpoint, but we also have an idealization of concepts and words, right? And a proclivity to take words beyond their normal meaning and turn them into something abstract and not necessarily still in the same context with the real world. So we'll talk about that as well as we go. But I think this idea that we will never kind of get away from that. And I think one of the great things about James is being a psychologist, he really focused in on the psychological needs of us as people, right? And how philosophy fits into that. And this is one aspect of that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's something you brought up when we were putting together the outline was, James is really looking at philosophy from the lens of, okay, what are our kind of psychological needs as humans, and then, how can we kind of pick a philosophy that is going to kind of meet those needs, or might even be saying like people kind of do this unconsciously, and that like, he does say up front that a lot of philosophers' philosophy is just kind of the outcome of whatever temperament they happen to be.
Yeah. I think in a lot of respects, he says the history of philosophy is a big rationalization of an inner needs that we have psychologically, right? I think I'm being too broad, but it's
sure, yeah.
He doesn't want to dismiss the idea that our temperaments and our psychology plays a role in why we choose what we choose and how we choose to rationalize that after the fact.
Yeah. Yep. Well, so we kind of hinted about this, current dilemma. He calls it, this is actually the first lecture, is called The Present Dilemma in Philosophy. He kind of breaks it down. There's, these two types of temperaments, two types of people. We have like the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded tend to be the rationalists. So he says they're rationalistic, intellectualistic, idealistic, optimistic, religious, free willist, monistic, which we'll say a lot more about, and dogmatic, in comparison to the tough-minded, empiricist, sensationalist, materialistic, pessimistic, irreligious, fatalistic, pluralistic, and skeptical.
I think sometimes when people read this, they think of those as being simplistic, dichotomies. I think that is an interesting insight from James, though, this idea of tender-minded versus tough-minded. The idea being, the tough-minded is going to take the world as it is, in all its infinite variety, right? Versus the tender-minded is going to try to construct some better world out of what they see. So let me put that another way, right? So if the rationalist, the tender-minded person, he would say is the devotee to abstract and eternal principles, right? Versus the the empiricist is the lover of facts in all their crude variety, right? So just this idea that as an inner nature, we have a tendency to kind of move toward one end of that spectrum or another. He's going to clearly say these aren't like either or propositions. One person is a one or the other. We're both of those things at all times. Right. But how our natural proclivities lead us one versus another in certain situations, we just have to be aware of that and recognize that it's going to alter the trajectory of philosophy that's we see as interesting or impactful to us.
Yeah, and it's a great point that he does say we're not one or the other. We kind of contain both of these, but maybe have a leaning one way or the other. And it also makes sense when he's talking about, I guess, the present dilemma in philosophy, in that it's not just like there's this team versus that team. I think he very much is speaking about within each of us, there is this kind of dilemma, this need for facts and evidence and empiricism, and this need for religion and a kind of holistic, all-encompassing philosophy for everything.
And I think one thing that's key for him is he'll say most people will combine these two in ways that are not necessarily consistent or coherent within themselves, right? But for most people, they don't, or for a lot of people, or some people maybe, it doesn't necessarily have to always be consistent or coherent. But he's going to say we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be vague about how we combine them, and we shouldn't be inconsistent or willy-nilly. We have to be purposeful about how we combine these two, because we're philosophers, right? He says, some of us are more than mere laymen in philosophy. We are worthy of the name amateur athletes. I think most people would say James is more than an amateur athlete in philosophy, but I think that idea of if we're going to really examine ourselves, right, and we're going to try to be philosophical in that way, we have to be clear about when we're combining these and why, and consistent throughout.
Right. He actually, in this first lecture, talks about Leibniz. Do you want to say a little bit about this?
I think... Yeah, he would consider, he considers in the lecture Leibniz as an example of a tender-minded or a rationalist, right? Clearly. To recall, Leibniz was the one who said, we live in the best of all possible worlds, and he eventually, he goes through a lengthy, what James might call a rationalization to get to that point. He kind of started there. Yep. I think James effectively says, isn't it convenient that his ending point was the same as his starting point? And you know what I mean? Like he's just kind of proving it to himself. And he says, look, rationalists need the world to be refined, and he uses that word in the sense of like, they need the world to make sense, be aesthetic, be pretty. Interesting. There's another book by Dewey, right? Who's another pragmatist, similar time, a little bit later on. But he says this idea of making the world aesthetic or beautiful really was inborn or came from the Greeks, who took their asceticism and turned it into part of their philosophy. And we can talk more about that later. But I think this idea that these rationalists need the world to be beautiful in some way. They look for simplicity. They look for symmetry. They look for things that have some kind of order to them. Yep. And James is going to say the world just isn't like that. The world just isn't refined. They're projecting their own needs onto the world and trying to conform it to those needs instead of taking the world as it is.
Yeah, that's excellent. And so he says Leibniz's feeble grasp of reality is too obvious to need comment for me. It is evident that no realistic image of the experience of a damned soul has ever approached the portals of his mind. And he quotes something written by this anarchist named Morrison Swift, which is basically an article about this man in Cleveland who basically was like involved in like a murder-suicide, just lived this horrible life and killed his children and killed himself. And, you know, he brings that up, I think, just to pretty much say like, okay, you can sit in your armchair and philosophize about how we live in the best possible world, but like, let's look at the facts on the ground. Like, clearly we don't live in the best possible world, just like read a newspaper.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's really what he's trying to get here is we do have these psychological needs. We have to recognize them. We can't just say we're not going to have them. But so we need a way through both, right? We need a way that appreciates the realness of the world, the world that we have, and also can allow us the ability to think more abstractly and kind of be more. He's going to use the word religious, but I think we can talk about in what sense he means that. Yeah. At the same time, right? So
there was one other kind of point he brings up when he's kind of talking about rationalists. It's the kind of this idea that rationalists are kind of more in love with their abstractions or their concepts than the actual facts on the ground. And he mentions this person who, you know, apparently was very much in love with the idea of beauty, but didn't actually love anything beautiful. Like he didn't actually love beautiful music or poetry or anything like that. And it reminded me, I heard something similarly said about George Harrison, the Beatle. People said about him, or at least one critic kind of said about him, that he loved love, but he hated people. So I think this is another thing that James is kind of speaking to, is like, I don't know, as a pragmatist, maybe he's kind of opposed to the fetishization of concepts and ideas at the expense of like any real contact with reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also, you know, the scientific method shining through again, as we talked about the influences here, right? It's do you try to make your facts fit your theory, or do you build a theory around the facts? And and he's saying we should do the latter, right? We shouldn't, all these people you mentioned, you know, the idea that we're changing the way we're viewing the world to make it conform to what we see as beautiful or simple or rational, whatever, instead of just taking things as they are, as we experience them, recognizing that we don't experience the full world. You know, obviously we are limited by our senses. We only experience the things that we experience and the way we experience them. But later we'll talk about what we do experience is the world. It's not some, you know, made up version of it, right? As far as James is concerned. So we can take that experience as it is. We can use that as a basis for building our structures and our philosophies on, keeping in mind the inborn need we have to synthesize and to try to pull these things together into common notions and ideas that we can spread across our experience.
That's great. That's great. So maybe we can walk a little bit through the pragmatic method.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. I think, so James says, you know, what is pragmatism is two things. It's a method and it's a theory of truth, right? So the method part of it, he says it's primarily a method for settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might be interminable, right? So in order to do this, we're going to try to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion rather than that notion were true? Mm-hmm. Right. So this is really, again, it's a method, you know, of evaluating disputes that we don't have empirical evidence for or against, or we have limited evidence for. When you have limited evidence and limited empirical scientific evidence to go by, you still have to act in the world, right? So then you need to look at outcomes, right? So he says the whole function of philosophy ought to be to find out what definite difference it will make to you and me at definite instance of our life if this world formula or that world formula be the true one.
Yeah.
Right. So it becomes a task of philosophers to help people work through this method and help them identify what the difference is to these different world formulas or world views or different concepts would be for regular people.
Right. Yeah. That's a theme that kind of comes up throughout this book of kind of what difference would it make if this were true. Do you want to talk about the squirrel story? Do you think that'd be a good place to go here? Or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so he mentions at the beginning of this lecture too, this story of a time he went camping, and maybe I'll just read it because I think it does kind of get to this point nicely. He says, some years ago, being with a camping party in the mountains, I returned from a solitary ramble to find everyone engaged in a ferocious metaphysical dispute. The corpus of this dispute was a squirrel, a live squirrel supposed to be clinging to one side of a tree trunk, while over against the tree's opposite side, a human being was imagined to stand. This human witness tries to get sight of the squirrel by moving rapidly around the tree, but no matter how fast he goes, the squirrel moves as fast in the opposite direction and always keeps the tree between himself and the man, so that never a glimpse of him is caught. The resultant metaphysical problem now is this: does the man go round the squirrel or not? He goes round the tree, sure enough, and the squirrel is on the tree, but does he go round the squirrel? And I won't read all of this, but basically half of the people that, were camping with James said yes, half of them said no. They asked James to kind of settle the dispute. And the way that he responded, he says, which party is right, I said, depends on what you practically mean by going round the squirrel. If you mean passing from the north of him to the east, then to the south, then to the west, and then to the north again, obviously the man does go round him, for he occupies these successive positions. But if on the contrary you mean being first in front of him, and then on the right of him, then behind him, then on his left, and finally in front again, basically the answer is no. So he's saying it depends how we're kind of defining this word or this phrase going around. And I think he brings that up to say, basically, you guys are fighting about something that's not actually, I don't want to say it's not actually real, but it's basically you're fighting about semantics rather than metaphysics.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think semantics, and back to that point of view, right? If you are perched on top of the tree, looking down, right, you have a different point of view than if you're at the campfire, right? So the questions maybe don't make sense in that, and depending on your point of view. Maybe this is a good time just to mention that, James, this is a lecture, I think you already mentioned that, a public lecture for, the public that he's, one of the things he's fantastic about is his great writing style and a great way of kind of conveying this information that maybe is not, like an analytic philosopher would do when they're writing a book. It's not that kind of approach. Yeah. It's very accessible.
Like storytelling.
Right. Storytelling, I think he was a very charismatic and engaging speaker. He was very highly regarded in that respect and highly sought after. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a nice aspect to this is he's trying to make this understandable for everybody to apply, and he's going through some different arguments and proofs, but he's not necessarily engaging in every possible nook and cranny of the argument that he's putting forward in a public lecture. Yeah,
that's definitely fair. Well, it seemed, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it seemed to me he kind of brings that up to kind of again distance himself from the kind of armchair philosophizing and these kind of like disputes. He says it's astonishing to see how many philosophical disputes collapse into insignificance the moment you subject them to this simple test of tracing a concrete consequence. So I saw that as some of the reason that he brought up that story is just like so much of what's happening in philosophy today is kind of arguing about definitions, and when we actually use the pragmatic maximum of like how would things be different, it actually doesn't move the needle.
Yeah, agreed. I think he was definitely skeptical and wary of the over professionalization of some the philosophy in general. He wrote another article called PhD Octopus where he lamented the number of PhDs coming out. And I think it's also a ton of other philosophers have drawn parallels to Wittgenstein, and I think it's definitely a theme throughout this part of the century of acknowledging that some of these disputes and kind of scholasticism of the day is just not useful, not helpful, and really hasn't given us what we wanted over the past couple thousand years. So let's stop trying to do that.
Do we want to say more about pragmatic truth? We talked a little bit about the pragmatic method.
Well, maybe just one more note there I want to make sure we hit it on is that the method he mentions, right? It's a method only. There's no dogmas and no principles. It's very clear about that. It's not based on any kind of foundation or first principle. And he says it's important to think about it as an attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, and facts. So I really like this idea that pragmatism is an attitude. It's not a series of prescriptions or principles. It's the attitude we bring to the world of that kind of, the tough and tender-mindedness that we'd already talked about, as well as this method. If you think about it like an attitudinal framework instead of a set of rules or a prescribed process, I think it's more impactful.
And is the attitude, just so I'm understanding this correctly, is the attitude to just kind of look at the consequences of things, to kind of look at, okay, if this is true, what is the consequence of that? Yeah,
I think, it's looking towards, he says, fruits, consequences, and facts, right? So looking at the facts, looking at the experience we have, looking at the consequences of our beliefs, recognizing that beliefs are habits of action. He got a lot of that from Peirce, right? This idea that beliefs, and he defines beliefs very broadly, right, is really are things that make us act the way we do, and we have to be cognizant and we have to justify those beliefs, at least to ourselves, that they cohere and that they aren't just based on external things like first principles, like, and there's a lot of examples we can go through of, authority or kind of unquestioned assumptions. And again, you could say Socrates was a pragmatist, right? This idea that we have to continue to evaluate our beliefs based on the experiences that we have, based on any new experiences that we have, and how they fit together as a whole, if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. And one of the things you said to me the other day was, there are certain things that you can believe. They're kind of like free. Like you don't have to change any of your other beliefs to believe them. There are other things where in order to believe that thing, you're going to have to change all of these other beliefs in order for that to kind of cohere.
Yes. And I love this part about pragmatism, right? If we think about our beliefs as habits of action, we all have beliefs. We've all had beliefs that have built upon our experiences over however many decades we've been around. And all of those beliefs we can think about as being a web of beliefs, right? And this is a different author came up with it, but I think this is a good way to think about it, right? This idea of we have a variety of different beliefs. Some, if each belief is a node on a web, right, and they are connected to other beliefs. Some beliefs have connections to all of other beliefs, or a lot of other beliefs, right? So they're very strong, and taking that belief out would be very difficult because it would mean the connections to a whole bunch of other beliefs were lost, right? If we said, I don't believe that if I drop this pencil, it's going to fall to the ground, that's so connected to every other belief I have of the world. Like I can't even really imagine what that would mean. You know what I mean? Versus I said, if I said, well, I believe that, the car outside is green instead of blue, I could believe that because maybe I mistook it when I came in, whatever.
Right.
So it's really about how we adapt these experiences to our web of belief and which beliefs we hold fundamental. And I think the pragmatists really focus on this idea of fallibility, that no belief is infallible. No belief is not subject to revision. We need to make sure all of our beliefs are subject to revision, but we need to recognize that it's very psychologically difficult for us to revise beliefs that are so ingrained. I mean, we've all read stories about this for people that have been, put in a cult for 2 decades, and then it's very hard to kind of revise that, right?
Yep.
So that's why I say, maybe somebody who believes in God, for example, that belief is so ingrained, it's very difficult for them to remove it, let's say. But maybe they can believe that this church meets their needs better than this one or something. I'm kind of outside of my lane here, but I think that's the idea. Right?
No, I mean, that's great. I love that kind of visual of like some beliefs basically have, probably thousands of different connections to other beliefs, whereas others, maybe there's only one or two or zero. So it's those beliefs with the many connections that are going to be hardest to kind of uproot. And one of the things we talked about the other day as well, we mentioned, the Civil War was within a couple decades, recent memory for James writing this. And I actually learned this recently. I took a trip to Gettysburg this year, and one of the things that one of the museum curators was telling me about was, one of the reasons there were so many casualties in the Civil War is because the technology of the rifles had dramatically improved. It used to be the fact that, you fire your musket and it's just like, I don't know, I'm throwing out some numbers here, but 1 in 10 chance you're going to hit that person standing 30 yards away. But with the advent of rifling, this new invention where the bullet is actually spinning within the barrel, now it very much increased the accuracy for firing at somebody. And the reason there were so many casualties is because even though there was this new technology that was making, the death rate so much higher, they're still using these outdated battle tactics based on the belief of what honorable fighting meant. It wasn't honorable to kind of hide in a trench and fire willy-nilly. It was much honorable to charge. And maybe this is a good example of a belief of what honor looks like.
Right.
Like somebody not wanting to kind of adjust that or update that based on new experience.
Yeah, I mean, somehow that belief of what honor meant, right, was more powerful than the experience that was in front of their eyes, right? And that it was too hard to dislodge that belief of honor for, sure, a variety of reasons, a hierarchy of the military and all these other things, right? But I think that the Civil War, the lessons of the Civil War can't be understated for pragmatism, right? They really saw that as the main lesson was, for the pragmatists, was to get rid of all kind of absolutism, right? And to stop being kind of stuck and tenacious in your belief system and your ideas, that you have to be more flexible and you have to be more willing to change your beliefs when evidence arrives. I think for exactly that reason. I don't think any of us here, at least I can't imagine what it would have been like to live through that, right? But I think, it affected them all, certainly Peirce, James, Dewey, profoundly in the memory of that. So,
yeah.
As long as the beliefs hang together and reflect our experience and also, cohere with each other, James later is going to say, right, then you can, and get in this concept of meliorism, right? Then you can have beliefs that are there just that make you feel better. As long as all those other things are true, like as long as they hang together with everything else, they reflect your experience, and then you can make decisions about, well, this belief has a psychological benefit for me to hold, so then I'm going to hold it. Right? But it doesn't mean you can believe in anything, and it doesn't mean relativism, which we'll talk about later, but it does mean that all things being equal, if your web holds together nicely, you can make decisions on other beliefs that are hard to settle one way or another.
Well, maybe that's a good segue to start going through some of these different, the belief in free will versus the belief in determinism, the belief in kind of intelligent design, and how he kind of thinks about this as a pragmatist. The point I saw him kind of getting at is him saying, like, what you believe about the creation of the universe is going to have real world impacts in kind of how you behave and what your attitude on life and everything is. So if you believe that, there's a intelligent creator or a God, whatever you want to call it, and that there is going to be some kind of, revelation at the end, and that everything's kind of leading towards this completeness, that's going to have a very different impact on most people than if you believe that, there's Big Bang and, ultimately, the sun is going to explode within, however many years. It creates a very different belief. And again, kind of going back on the instead of looking at, well, which one of these is true, the pragmatist is going to look at like, well, what is the consequence of believing one of these things versus the other?
Yeah, I think in the example of design, I believe he talks about, if the world if we were at the end of the universe today, then looking back somehow, it wouldn't matter if it was designed or not. Like it was what it was, right? The purpose of believing in some kind of intelligent design or some kind of design at all is to affect our future behavior or to make us feel a certain way about the future, right? And this is where he's saying that really the sole meaning of that is a better promise of the world's outcome, right? It might be true, it might be false, but if it helps you to believe that the world will be better in the future, does that change your behavior? Does that help you act a certain way? Does that turn you into the kind of person you want to be with the actions that you want to have? So I think it's always challenging with this because it's, you don't want to, he's not Pollyannish, right? He's not just saying just believe whatever you want. He's saying, look, we don't know if it's designed or not. We think we know these things. We know about the Big Bang. We know about how matter works now. We know a ton of things, right? But you could always make an argument for a metaphysical argument about the nature of reality that's beyond our ability to perceive, right? And if we're going to make those arguments and we have no way to verify or falsify them in any way, they kind of remove themselves from the realm of scientific hypothesis and turn into this land of, well, what happens if I believe in that, right?
Right,
and then what does this do for me and for our society and for my family and all these things, right?
Another thing he brings up is the belief in free will versus determinism.
Right.
Again, kind of saying, if you just believe everything is determined and there is no free will, this is going to make you kind of gloomy, maybe depressed, feeling kind of impotent. Whereas if you feel that you have free will, you have agency, this is going to leave you feeling, empowered, potent, and strong. And, kind of based on that, hey, from a pragmatic standpoint, it's more useful and therefore more true to believe in free will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And James, personally, he had a crisis where he was convinced, because of all the scientism at the time and the period he was in, he became convinced that in determinism, that everything was determined, and it put him into a depression. And it was, by all accounts, my understanding, very difficult for him. He came across an author that he's reading about that helped convince him that free will was possible, and also convince him that he had to choose to believe in free will in order to overcome his depression, right? So
super fascinating.
Yeah. So like, again, he talks in this book as well about the possible as a kind of a third realm, right? There's facts, but then there's possible facts, or things that could be, that adhere to our knowledge of other facts and adhere to our belief of how the world works or the universe works, but we haven't seen yet. So, whatever, the unicorn, right? Conceivably that could be a real animal. We understand it's not a real animal. But I've been saying that's not so outside of the bounds of, what we experience that it's completely, crazy, right?
Right.
So he leaves room for that. The possible, if it's possible, then you can choose to engage with it or not, right? And of course, we're all going to have our different views of what possible is, and how far out of the bounds of reality we're going to go. But yeah, I think that's really important for him, is this idea to leave room for some of this faith. And I don't mean faith like faith, religious faith, but faith in being able to make provisional decisions and provisional beliefs, because every belief is fallible and you're ready to revise it at any time. Then you can make provisional beliefs part of yourself, because you know you can change them, and you know that to be on the lookout for the consequences of that belief, which I think is important, because it's not just, if I choose to believe in unicorns, I have to double down on that for the rest of my life. He's saying, no, you can choose to believe in unicorns, but then, if evidence comes to light, then you have to revise that.
Right. Well, so there's a couple of things you said that I wanted to follow up on. One was, the story about James and how in his actual life he became depressed by this belief in determinism, and then kind of started believing in free will based on some arguments and whatnot. I think that story also just connects to the subjectivity of all of this, and that, I think James would also agree that for some people, believing in determinism probably wouldn't have a depressive effect on them, but for him it did. And that's kind of the argument he makes about religion and believing in intelligent design and whatnot, and that, for some of these more kind of tough-minded folks out there, you might be perfectly happy being an atheist, and that doesn't really keep you up at night too much. But for others, a belief in God is kind of more necessary for, psychological health, or I don't know if that's the right way to frame this, but you know what I'm trying to say here? Yeah,
I do. And I it is about the ability to revise your beliefs, right? If someone had proven to James, or if he got the right experience to show that determinism, that we all are determined in every way, he would revise that belief and believe in determinism, right? At the time, for him, it wasn't proven either way. There are arguments about abounding, right? And he had to make a decision based on what he found, right? And what he, not just the evidence in front of him, but because it was inconclusive, also the ends that, what would it mean to believe in either determinism or free will? Right. And we obviously have, tons of things like this today, right? But again, he's saying, you can't discard the evidence, and you can't discard the experience that we are given and that we seek out. But when that's not conclusive, you can use this as a method to help you determine between different options, as long as you all hold them loosely and are ready to pivot as needed. If, Jesus comes down tomorrow and says, I'm back, atheists should say, I guess I was wrong, and go, you know what I mean? We should all revise our beliefs, right?
Right.
And if it turns out aliens have been here the whole time, like these evidence things should cause us to revise our beliefs, obviously, and not just double down on them.
One of the things that kind of runs throughout the course of these lectures is this idea that we are constantly kind of revising, constantly evolving what we believe to be true. And he kind of rails against the, rationalist view that the truth is already complete. He wants to kind of, can we talk a little bit more about this idea of the incompleteness of truth?
Yeah, no, I think it's, again, the truth isn't out there to be found, and it's not complete it's not in any complete state anywhere, as well as the universe is not complete, right? He continually says, we are creating the universe now as we go, right? We are creating concepts. We're creating connections between disparate ideas, concepts, and actual physical things, and all the, everything that we're doing and the universe is doing is creating it and building it. He's saying that it's not just like a one, and he has a lot of discussion about one versus many. It's not one thing that we're participating in that's unchanging, eternal. No, it's the variety that is continuously changing and growing and expanding, or whatever, continuing to move toward change, but not towards some end fixed goal of the ultimate good or the ultimate truth or anything like that. It's just continuing to evolve, change, and be added to by everyone who participates in the universe.
And I guess on that point, he says the import of the difference between pragmatism and rationalism is now in sight throughout its whole extent. The essential contrast is that for rationalism, reality is ready-made and complete from all eternity, while for pragmatism, it is still in the making and awaits part of its complexion from the future.
Yeah, and this to me is why one of the things I really like about pragmatism, and he separates his radical pluralism from his pragmatism, but I combine them.
Okay.
But something about and this is my psychology, right? A fixed eternal universe that we're just kind of a reflection of somehow is more depressing to me than a universe that we don't know where it's going to go and where it's going to end up, and we don't know how the world's going to be in the next year, let alone 100 years or whatever. But we are participating in it getting there, and we are taking action to make the world and the universe what it is. That's to me more optimistic and humanistic than the reverse.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to get to some of the kind of common objections to pragmatism, but before we do, I was hoping we could just kind of nail down a little bit harder on this kind of pragmatic definition of truth and talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, sounds good.
So he talks a decent amount about kind of cash value or even this credit system. Maybe I'll just read a few of these quotes so we can kind of flesh them out. He says, truth lives for the most part on a credit system. Our thoughts and beliefs pass so long as nothing challenges them, just as banknotes pass so long as nobody refuses them. But this all points to direct face-to-face verification somewhere, without which the fabric of truth collapses like a financial system with no cash basis whatever.
Yeah, I love that. I think this idea of how he uses these analogies kind of adds this kind of cash value concept in the credit system is important, right? And this, again, we have to take a lot of things on, again, belief, either belief of our own experience, but often belief of other people's experience.
Yeah.
And we should take those beliefs and we should hold them tentatively and subject to revision. But that's how we learn as humans, right? And that's how we do it. So he's not saying we can't do that. He's not saying we can't do things on credit. I think he's, eventually he's saying that we have an obligation to try to get the best credit we can, right? To make sure that these things that we're taking on credit are not going to default later on.
He also at times, I think this is in the same chapter, talks about truth almost like an adjective rather than a noun. So I'll read some of this as well. He says, in the case of wealth, we all see the fallacy. We know that wealth is but a name for concrete processes that certain men's lives play a part in, and not a natural excellence found in Rockefeller and Carnegie. Like wealth, health also lives in rebus. It is a name for processes as digestion, circulation, sleep, etc., that go on happily. And then he says, with truth, most people go over the border entirely and treat the rationalistic account as self-evident. But really, all these words in TH are exactly similar. Truth exists anti-rem just as much and as little as the other things do. The way I understood this idea is, when we see somebody who is strong or wealthy, somebody who has strength or wealth, we see those as like kind of attributes of that person. We can imagine that person minus those attributes. We could imagine that same person poor or weak. But when we say something is true, we're not kind of seeing it in that same attributional way. We're not actually saying like that thing, contains truth or it doesn't. We're like, it either is that thing or it isn't.
Yeah, truth isn't a part of a thing, right? It's something we bring to it. So nobody says, when we say someone is wealthy, and you just read this, right? When we say someone is wealthy, we don't think that there's something in them that is wealth.
Yeah.
They don't have a part of them that is wealth that constitute them being wealthy. The same for healthy, right? What we say is that they have some externality, which is a bunch of money in the bank that makes them wealthy, or whatever, how we're using the term. And that's all he's saying that truth is, right? There's nothing inside a thing that is truth that we can point to say, well, that's the truth molecule, or that's the truth gene, right?
Yeah.
No, like there's nothing there that's like that. It's and therefore it can change over time. And it can change not only over time, but also based on the point of view and the perspective that you're bringing to it. So, again, he's going to say truths emerge from facts, right? The facts are not true. They simply are. And he also points out, I think elsewhere in this chapter, if I'm not mistaken, we have a natural tendency to kind of fetishize or idealize words over time, and we will build up a word to make it into some kind of rationalist, absolutist type of thing. Obviously, we've seen this, this is as old as Plato and Socrates, right? We can, what is justice? Well,
Right.
So when we take these words and we kind of try to make them into more than signs and noises for a given usage, we automatically are putting them on this otherworldly plane.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is also, again, like what Wittgenstein and some others were trying to get to, right? These are signs and signals, and their meaning is their use, right? And I think James would agree with that, right? That it's about how we use these terms that dictates what they mean, there's not some meaning above and beyond that.
It's not fixed.
It's not
right?
fixed. Right?
Yeah. One of the things that came up in the discussion group when I was doing a meetup on this was the idea of like growth mindset and fixed mindset, which is like a kind of more not new age, but newer psychology book. And I think in some ways, like a fixed mindset person is one who kind of identifies, like their identity is that thing. I am a poor person. I am a dumb person, or even, it could be a positive. I am a strong person. Whereas the growth mindset sees it as more, this is an attribute, or this is something that is in flux. I don't know, historically have been strong, or I think one is less of a comment about identity, and the other is a comment about some kind of feature. So there seems to be some kind of connection here with how he's talking about truth.
Absolutely. And I think that that also resonates with again the rise of statistics at this time. I think of it like a cone of certainty, or like the hurricane trackers. You see, the cone gets wider as time goes on, right? As the forecast expands. So we know where the hurricane is going to be a minute from now, but you don't know where it's going to be 10 hours from now.
Yeah.
And we really don't know where it's going to be 20 hours from now. I'm making it whatever the numbers are. That's the way I see this in the pragmatic method as well, is everything that has gone into making this moment and making us who we are today is fixed. That's not changing, right? But the experience that lays in front of us is that cone that is expanding out more and more as time goes on, and that's where truth can change. That's where these things can have different meanings, and that's where we can take our action to make, to change things as we go. So, completely agree with the fixed and growth mindset. That's a very valuable topic from how we behave in the world and kind of how we respond to the world. And I think James would agree with the idea that we should retain a growth mindset at all times and be wary of locking ourselves into any kind of fixed or rigid or dogmatic thinking.
Right, which is what he accuses the rationalists or the tender-minded of doing.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of all I had there. Maybe we can move into some of the kind of common objections that, probably a lot of people are thinking at this point.
Sure.
I guess the first kind of question along these lines that I had would be, okay, how does this idea of pragmatic truth kind of differ from relativism?
Yeah, a couple of things there. I think, like Peirce had this idea that eventually hypothetically, right, all right, kind of, commonly minded people would gravitate toward the same truths, right? Because over, infinite time, you would get enough of the experience, right, to coalesce around the right truth, right? So as a society, we'd eventually, so that's not what James is saying exactly, but this idea that it's not, again, that we're finding the truth collectively, it's that we're agreeing on it. And then later pragmatists would really focus on this kind of agreement, and James in here even says this is a democratic philosophy, right? This is really a pluralistic democratic philosophy of how do we coalesce around the same view of truth, but it's not an anything goes, everybody can have their own truth. It's we all have to, or sufficient proportions of us have to agree with the same truths in order to live together, right? So it's probably not a great answer. I think that is a charge that pragmatists get of relativism. I just think that it's misguided because, again, James would say, you can't just say the earth is flat, right? Because we have empirical evidence that it's not. You can't just say that's my truth and I'm sticking with it. That is pathology to him. Right. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about all the facts are in and we still don't know if it's this or that. Here's a method to help you provisionally pick one of those because you have to pick something.
Well, so I think you're speaking to the fact that, like, all right, well, if there's evidence against it, you can't just kind of claim anything you want. But I think it's also right that if you believe something that, is not kind of true in some kind of objective way, also, like, it's not going to have, a lot of times it's not going to have utility for you either. If I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. I don't know, I choose to believe that fire is not hot because that, I don't want it to be. You can believe that, but it's not going to be useful to you.
Right.
On that note, though, this just came up for me, but have you heard of the concept of metaphorical truth?
Sure.
So just to spell that out, it's basically the idea that there are some things that are kind of not true in some objective way, but if you act as if they are true, if you believe they're true, they're actually kind of more useful. Example I heard Sam Harris bring up, he's talking about, believing that every firearm that you hold is loaded. That can be something where, you can be looking at this gun and see that the chamber is empty. It's objectively not true, but acting as if it's a loaded firearm is going to be more useful. You could say some similar thing again, talking about like belief in God, where it's, I don't know, for some reason I'm thinking of kind of like Pascal's wager and like not to equate belief in God to believing a firearm is loaded or not loaded, but it's a similar kind of bargain in that, like in Pascal's wager, it's like, well, if there is no God, then there's no kind of downside to believing it. But if there is a God, there's definitely a downside to not believing. In the same way that, like, there's no downside to acting as if a firearm is loaded and it's not loaded. Yeah. Do you see where I'm kind of going here? Like, yeah.
Agreed. Those are the heuristic rules of life that we all get over time, right? I mean, the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Like, that is just works out better for us to believe that. But we know that they're not going to do exactly unto us like we do to them.
Yeah.
But it just makes our lives better if we do that consistently. Right. So we just kind of acknowledge that as a truth, because that habit and that action is useful to everybody and beneficial. And then we recognize when we're not doing it because we've internalized that as a truth, and we either decide we don't care if we're not doing it, or we think we need to change our behavior. But I think all those, with religion as well, right? The idea, believing in God, again, is one thing, but believing that, you should give alms to your church or something, or believe, which church do you belong to? Or what is your relationship to the, is it important to go every Sunday or Saturday or whatever, these are all the decisions that we all make. And that's, I think it's on the margins that we make these decisions. Like most people have probably made all the big decisions. The big beliefs in their lives are probably here to stay for most people, the big beliefs. It's the smaller ones that go around those that are continually challenged.
I think you're right on the only kind of counterexample I think of is, like the kind of classic story of the atheist on his deathbed, kind of converting to religion, which I guess could even be, a pragmatist might say, well, throughout that person's entire life, they didn't, need a belief in God, and in those last couple hours of life, like they did. So it was true when they didn't believe in God, and true now after they've converted.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think I think it's also, again, you get more experience, and you have to pull that into your web of belief. And if you're on your deathbed and your experience is telling you something new that you've never experienced before,
that too,
that changes your belief system, maybe.
Absolutely. There's a great little novella by Tolstoy. What's it? Death of Ivan Ilyich.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's, it's classic example. No, spoilers if anybody hasn't read it, but the kind of, spiritual awakening in those final moments of life. And I guess the cynic might say, well, he's just kind of scared and wants to have some kind of feeling of security in that last minute. But you could also say he got new evidence in those final seconds of his life and changed his belief based on the new evidence coming in. Yeah.
And I think, James doesn't really get into it in this particular book, but there's something in pragmatism where we can't, and back to the relativist point, you can't just believe anything you want. That you do owe it to others to justify your beliefs in a way that they understand and could get behind you. You know what I mean? Like, there is a communal aspect to pragmatism, and very, again, democratic aspect, which I find really, really inspiring, right? The idea that if you're going to have a belief, whatever it is, all the ones we just talked about, in later on, other authors will talk about private versus public beliefs. But really, I think throughout pragmatism, there's this idea that if you have a belief, you need to be able to articulate and justify why you have it. And if other people can't get behind your justification, or you are the only one, right, then that's a sign that that belief is not to be trusted, right? So there is, again, a communal aspect to this, and an importance that the community is helping you shape these beliefs.
Well, kind of wrapping up here, the presentation you gave for our meetup was on kind of pragmatism today. I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts, rereading this piece and how that, maybe connects to the presentation you gave, or kind of how you're viewing pragmatism in the current landscape.
Yeah. I think I would just say, if anyone, for anybody listening to this, I would definitely encourage you to read some of these authors, right? This is really, this is a fun read. He's a great writer. And if you're an American, these ideas are so steeped, and I don't want to just say this is an American philosophy, because it's not, but it's, it just resonates, I think, so well, particularly if you are an American, right? I think it resonates across the world, but I think there's just something about the democratic aspect of it, the way we've kind of come up in our history, to where it really resonates. Peirce, James, Dewey are the three classical pragmatists that are definitely worth reading. I think James is the best place to start. I think Peirce is really fantastic, some of his articles, but they're a little more technical most of the time. And Dewey sometimes is a little bit tougher. There was a a bit of a lull in pragmatism after that, but then it really started taking off mid 20th century with Richard Rorty. Now we have a variety of different pragmatists really coming at it from different angles, right? Richard Rorty very much also, postmodernist flair, but also after that, right? Susan Hack and Robert Brandom and others, right? That really, in various ways, came back to different aspects of pragmatism. Some are really focused on the Peircean kind of component of pragmatism. Others, how it interacts with other school or other aspects of thought, like Hegel and others. So I think it's still a rich tradition. I think it's now becoming a lot more acknowledged that it really is a alternative philosophy, kind of on equal par with some of these others. I think, unfortunately, the word pragmatism made it harder to be accepted.
Okay.
I think when we hear pragmatism today, we just think practical. It just means practical.
Right.
This is really a term of art for this philosophy, and we should not just kind of equate it to our common usage of it. But I think, at the time, America didn't have the same philosophical, pedigree, obviously, as Europe did. I think, in general, pragmatism was, it took a while for the richness to be appreciated. But when you have James here saying very similar things to Wittgenstein, who said decades later, and you see kind of, early Heidegger, very pragmatic, right? You see the kind of the ways the other European philosophers have had very similar thoughts in different ways. You see how kind of rich this body of work is. So, yeah, definitely encourage everybody to read some of it.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thanks, Brent. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks.
I think
Thanks for having me.
People are going to dig it.
Hopefully.
Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.